So one of the major uses of React component lifecycle events is to call APIs to get refreshed data. So we're going to look at this Hacker News API. So I first have it in Postman here, hackernews.firebase IPA. I have a couple of GET calls here. The first one, top stories, returns a list just of IDs of the top stories. Right, no details at all. This shows too how REST APIs can be developed, like where essentially is teaching your application how to drill down. So these are just story IDs, and so the next GET would use those story IDs. And here, if you look at this Hacker News Firebase item, and then the item number that came back from the other story. So if you plug in one of these item numbers into this API call .json, then you get this. It's not, again, the article itself yet, but it is a link to the article. So it's a drill down effect from the ID to using the ID to get more information about the story to getting the actual URL, and then you can actually link to the story. So we'll use this in React. So in React, we're going to use the Fetch API, which is part of JavaScript's web API. So Fetch is pretty simple to use. It's asynchronous, and it allows us to make REST API calls. So here's a basic example here on MDN using Fetch. And it boils down really to this. So our example is going to look more complicated than this, but this is the basics of it. Fetch an API call, and then this is the promise chain. So this is the asynchronous part of this. This fetch happens and then returns immediately, and it sets up this promise chain. So as the different aspects of this are completed, JavaScript works down the promise chain and finally delivers the data. We'll look at promise chains in more detail in JavaScript. So here we have this response. This is the raw response. And then this response.json pulls out the JSON payload of the response. And then this takes that response, the JSON payload, and in this case, console logs it. But this is the JSON data stream right here. And we'll see the use of it over here in the React application. Our application currently looks like this. We'll make it look better in a second. I'll hit refresh, and we'll see empty array. And then as it works, then there's the response. So this is the result of essentially two URLs using fetch. So top stories, this is the URL, same URL I showed you back in Postman, the initial URL. It returns an array of story IDs. So here we have it, fetch top stories. Notice the URL here. Then the promise chain. Get the JSON.data, then take that data and map it into a series of URLs, and then use those URLs and actually fetch them. This is the second level where we're getting information about the specific items. So this leads from this promise chain leads to another fetch of the second URL, which then gets mapped into the JSON that we'll eventually see on the screen. Right now, all I have to do is JSON.stringify this.state.stories, so it's not conditioned at all. This is just the raw JSON that came back from the API call, and you can see information in there. I'll uncomment out views and comment out the raw view of it, and then we'll see views how the JSON is mapped here. Stories.map S to we take out the SID, the key, and then target blank, so it'll open up in a new tab. The s.url, s.title, and s.by. Where do those properties come from? Looking back at the JSON request in Postman, you can see it. Here's the JSON payload of this. It has some properties that we're not using. We're interested in by, ID, and URL primarily, and here they are used directly. URL, title, by, and so forth. It's going to condition a link, a set of links. Now save this file. The page is refreshed. And we'll see the top stories and their links. The same information we saw in PostScript, but now in a React page. Links work, and we're good. Thank you.